could not be interpreted beyond the 1962 judgment. In general, in the court's proceedings, each party to a dispute can select an ad hoc judge who will take part in making judgment along with the panel of judges. Speaking of the ad hoc judge, Mr. Kot was chosen by Thailand. Naturally, selected judge by the party to the dispute is always in favor of the party he or she represents. Mr. Kot, however, turned out to be the other way around. He criticized Thailand by stating that Thailand confused the meaning, and in French, a contresens, of the 1962 judgment. I hardly ever see an ad hoc judge criticizing the party he or she represents. For Cambodia, Mr. Guillaume was chosen, and he also issued a statement saying that he is pleased with the judgment at the Cambodia's request, which is in favor of Cambodia the most.
Third, Thai Foreign Minister Surapong Towichak said immediately following the announcement of the judgment that Cambodia and Thailand will open the discussion to create a joint development zone by referring to paragraph 106 of the judgment. However, the real meaning of paragraph 106 is that
with all these issues related to paragraph 106, we can say that Thailand is manipulating the terms stated in the judgment on 11th November 2013 to mislead the public that Thailand could either cooperate or joint manage the Cambodian territory at the area of the temple of Preah Vihear. But these claims are fabrications, given that the meaning, both in French and English text of the court's judgment stated that the parties to the dispute have to respect the Hague-based court ruling. That is to say, Thailand has to respect the judgment. Firstly, Thailand shall not obstruct Cambodia's free access to the temple of Preah Vihear. Secondly, Thailand is under an obligation not to take any deliberate measure which might damage directly or indirectly such heritage. Thirdly, Cambodia and Thailand must cooperate between themselves and the international community who love cultural property and are members of the World Heritage Committee for the protection, restoration, preservation and development of the temple of Preah Vihear and the temple area as World Heritage in the future.
In Phnom Penh, while Cambodian people applauded the court's judgment and are proud of their government's effort, the opposition party neither contribute to the task nor joined the people to welcome such achievement, but instead CNRP issued a statement dated 11 November 2013 calling the government to protect Cambodia's territory on the western and eastern borders. Concerning the border issues between Cambodia and her neighbors, His Excellency Dr. Sok-an clarified as follows.
The court has to abide by the principle of non-ultra petita, meaning that the court does not go beyond the request. As for Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos and Thailand, all must abide by the principle of the public international law called util possidetis juris, a Greek term that is kept in its original form in international law. It means that each country should recognize the legacy left for us, such as the issue of border. For border issue, if it was revoked, there would be hostility that would lead to wars and serious clashes between countries, especially with the neighboring country. And thus, not only Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos and Thailand, most countries in the world which recognize the principle called util possidetis juris, or in French called principe de l'intangibilité de la frontière, have to accept the legacies left to them. France had negotiated with Thailand and they had concluded the 1904 convention and produced the 1907 maps. So, we have now accepted these maps and used them until today. But the problem was that the scale was too small, like the map of 1/200,000. We have to enlarge the scale of the map. We have to enlarge scale and plant more border poles. So what we have to do is to conduct the actual delimitation work on the ground by applying what we have on the map. Both Cambodia and Thailand must go through rounds of negotiations and agree on the recognition of the enlarged map before we plant the border poles. The tiny scale map was transposed to the large scale map so that the real work can be implemented by planting big border poles. We do the same with Vietnam, though the process goes faster compared to Thailand. We implemented the maps that were published in 1930s, 1940 and 1950 and produced by the Service Géographique de l'Indochine, an agency created by France. The agency was dissolved after our independence and their work were given back to each respective country. Before the independence, Cambodia, Vietnam and Laos only had a single agency producing the map, and thus until today we continue to recognize that map, and so does Vietnam. We now have the Survey and Demarcation of Land Boundary Commission working on all boundary issues, and the same principle is applied to how we deal with Thailand, how we deal with Vietnam, and how we deal with Laos. We abide by the principle of util possidetis juris. It is not like we use the principle discriminately against Thailand, Vietnam and Laos. Dealing with Vietnam goes even faster than dealing with Thailand, and for Laos we have planted more than 80% of the border poles. With Vietnam, the process of border demarcation is underway, but we postponed the work of border demarcations in some areas due to our general election. Now that the election is over, we are resuming the work to plant the small, medium and big border poles. When two neighboring countries have a well-defined map that is jointly recognized by the parties and major international organizations, and the border poles planted on actual land, then the boundary disputes can ultimately be put to an end. In the case of Europe, during the period of World War I and World War II, there was fierce fighting resulted from the boundary disputes. However, after their rounds of negotiation, they were able to reach agreements through treaties and conventions that were followed by border demarcation, some of which were constructed with concrete walls. Since they have much more money than we do, they installed the border poles wherever disputes arose. As we have seen concrete evidences when driving all the way from France to Switzerland and to Belgium, we saw some areas where the boundary walls installed like house fences. And what those walls are all about? Those are boundary walls. If boundary walls were placed in such a way, disputes would no longer persist. The boundary walls are so tight, but in our case, we do not have the boundary poles in place, and they exist only on the map. They do not exist on land. Hence, there is dispute, since there is no concrete evidence sitting on the ground. In this respect, the committee does wish to resolve the issues in such a manner. We do want the complete border demarcations with Vietnam, Laos and Thailand. This would be a new era. There would be no border disputes because the big concrete border poles could not be removed, and wherever there was potential conflict, the concrete border walls would be built right there. There would be then no more conflicts. We can see the experiences in the evolution of history, what other countries have gone through before us. Once there are clear boundary lines and well-defined maps, there are no need for passports and borders because the legal basis is already very clear. Let's have a look at Schengen. In Europe, a visa issued by one country can be used to travel to the rest in the region. There are some people working in Germany, but they reside in France because their houses are there. Some others work in France, but their houses are in Germany. It is subjected to the types of the tax system. They reside in those areas that require them to pay less taxes, and they cross borders to come to work daily. However, such ease and facilitation could only be possible unless there is a clear foundation, well-defined maps, border poles, and no border controversial issues. The restrictions would be gradually relaxed to facilitate cross-border interaction between people to people, goods and services, and means of transportation. As with us and ASEAN, it is also gradually introduced. However, the problem is that the demarcations with Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam have yet completed. If the demarcation was completed, everything would be resolved. And this is the major task that is taken seriously by the royal government under the leadership of Samdech Dacho Hun Sen, who himself as well as the royal government are committed to accomplish. The commitment is to have clear boundary lines on maps, in treaties and conventions, as well as on land. This is our ultimate goal. So the question that we only preoccupy with the West and not the East is just people making noise, which is absolutely wrong.
While there are some criticisms in Phnom Penh and misleading by the certain Thai groups in Bangkok, the truth remains unchanged. Samdech Techo Hun Sen, Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Cambodia, announced that Cambodia, as a member state of the United Nations, respects and implements the ICJ's judgment on 11 November 2013.
I would like to emphasize that, on the legal principle, parties to any dispute are bound to fully and effectively implement any national or international court's judgments and its meaning. Therefore, in the case concerning the temple of Preah Vihear, the ICJ in The Hague rendered its judgment in 1962, and the court rendered its judgment for the interpretation of the 1962 judgment on its meaning and scope on 11 November 2013. The parties to the dispute, Cambodia and Thailand, are bound to fully implement the court's judgment and its meaning. In this regard, both parties cannot disagree and must observe the court's judgment. Article 94 of the UN's Charter clearly stipulates in paragraph 1 that all parties to the dispute are bound to implement the court's judgment and its meaning. Further, Article 94, paragraph 2 stipulates that if any party does not honor the court's judgment and indeed the other party in dispute could file the complaint with the United Nations Security Council. Such stipulations are aimed at guaranteeing the binding force respected by all member states of the United Nations to ensuring peace in the world. In addition to the obligation of members under the scope of the UN Charter and also with the terms of bilateral framework of both governments, Cambodia and Thailand have been implementing the Phase 2 to avoid history from repeating itself.
On
28 October 2013 in Poipet, His Excellency Deputy Prime Minister Hao Nam Hong met with Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, His Excellency Surapong Tawichak Chaikul, and both parties agreed to implement the court's judgment through all peaceful means and to refrain from any use of force. Then, what should we do with the Phase 2? After the court's decision, we have to cooperatively work hand in hand on the ground with Thailand in order to identify the boundary line of the territory belonging to Cambodia and territory belonging to Thailand. This requires a joint effort, and that either party cannot impose a unilateral solution. We both need to work together as clearly stated in paragraph 99 of the 11 November 2013 judgment. Now, the court has already decided. The court has had enough with the case. In 1962, immediately after the court's judgment, Thailand had unilaterally determined a boundary line, which was called July 1962 Thai Council of Ministers Line. Thereafter, Thailand dispatched its troops to set up barbed wire fences, but not this time around. Paragraph 99 of the reasoning of the 11 November 2013 judgment clearly states that the International Court of Justice does not permit any party to impose any deliberate unilateral measure. What does it mean? It means that the court has had enough. In 1962, following the judgment, Thailand did impose a unilateral solution. Now, the court ordered both parties not to take any unilateral solution.